Now, we mentioned the president's state of mind, what he's focused on during, as we've said, something that's cost Americans lives, that's cost people in the Bahamas lives. He's tweeting and defending his false claim that he thought Alabama could have been in the storm's path. Now, he tried to back that up in a number of ways. He shared a map of the storm's potential routes. This is a Donald Trump tweet, but as you see, that map was a week old. It was out of date when Trump made his erroneous claim about Dorian hitting Alabama on Sunday, a weekend when he said he was focused on monitoring the storm. It also includes a disclaimer: if anything on this graphic causes confusion, ignore the entire product. All of this after Donald Trump, of course, got himself in this mess by doubling down with his blown-up map of the storm's path, which included the extra line appeared to be drawn in Sharpie by someone using a Sharpie in the Oval Office, that was designed to try to edit what you see in the white line and say that the black line under the red arrow somehow meant Trump was right all along. Now, again, I can't report for you confirmation. We don't have, for example, Oval Office video surveillance about whether Donald Trump drew that line, and the White House won't really say much. We don't know if it wasn't the president, who else would have done it. Sometimes in these self-inflicted gaffes, you get a blame game going. But we do know it's technically illegal to put out false weather reports. So what about the DHS, Department of Homeland Security? Well, they're referring questions about the map back to the White House. And we do know what Donald Trump said when he was actually confronted about, again, something that should have been a non-issue that he made into an issue. Donald Trump wasn't mad or surprised about it. He didn't say he'd make an effort to track down the culprit either.
That map that you showed today looks like it's almost like a Sharpie.
I don't know.
Juanita Tolliver is campaign director for the Center for American Progress Action Fund. Sam Seder is the host of the Majority Report radio show. Good evening to both of you.
Hi, Ari.
Sam, this is a lighter story, so I go to you first. Not because you're a lightweight, but because you have a familiarity with these issues. I know from listening to you on the radio, sometimes you've mixed the serious with the absurd. What does it say against the backdrop of the serious that we've just reported, and we got our weather facts from Bill Cairns, that this is the state of the mind of the President of the United States, and people who say they're not surprised, is that good enough? Or should we be more than surprised? Should we be disappointed?
Well, yeah, of course. I think we should be disappointed. I think we should be a little bit nervous, frankly. I mean, I have no idea what this says about his state of the mind, but it's not great. But I think, there's something other that's going on here, and I would never credit Donald Trump with some type of grand strategy, or even I don't know how much we can attribute to, these being thoughtful tactics. But, if you listen to some of the right-wing radio, they're talking about this as the media is going after him for a gaffe, right? And there's a lot of things that none of us are talking about that are going on right now that I think, if you're a staffer for Donald Trump, you're thinking that maybe this is not they wouldn't have chosen this, but since it's there, it's not necessarily the worst thing to talk about because, you got to keep in mind, on one hand, Donald Trump's making these gaffes, but all this week, the presumptive frontrunner of the Democratic Party has made some very major gaffes himself. And so when they're thinking about the campaign, which of course they are, maybe they're thinking, let's keep it on less substantial things and keep it in this gaffe realm because we don't necessarily have a deficit.
Well, there's always that balance. I think it's a fair point to consider, as you say, whether or not it's deliberate. Juanita, I don't want to turn this discussion into a tease for what else is in the broadcast tonight, but we have a special report tonight on the way the Trump administration's gutting payday loans and trying to protect abusive financial lenders. I think that's a story they might not want on the air. It'll still be on the air tonight. We have a congressman talking immigration. We try to cover a lot of things here, and yet, Juanita, we know that the president doesn't like to be humiliated, and yet he seems to have self-owned here. Take a look at the way it's playing in late night.
This was the real original chart, which did not include Alabama, and this is what Trump showed us today with Alabama in it.
I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm impressed that Trump can locate Alabama on a map, but still.
Look at this. I mean, after this, I have to wonder if his high school report card was legit.
That map that you showed today looks like it's almost like a Sharpie.
I don't know.
Oh, he did it.
Juanita, what you'll notice is most of those clips of late night jokes didn't involve a lot of writing or addition. It was just sort of showing people watching a comedy show, this is the president.
And that's exactly what it is. This is the president who just can't seem to fathom using the words, "We got it wrong." He will do anything to save face. He will do anything to protect his ego. And even if it means force-feeding this false information to the American public, what I think should be alarming to most people is that he is continuously pressing this message. At one point, sure, it can be as a distraction, but in reality, it's because he believes it. He really wants to drive this home. And we should all be alarmed by that, because I'm sure this is the same approach. Like, at the end of the day, Trump is the commander-in-chief. He is the one who controls our military forces. He's the one in the Situation Room. And his approach to this is probably being mirrored in those other situations. Yeah. So this should raise a lot of red flags for the American public, that he is doubling down on this and force-feeding this narrative to the American public when Americans' lives are at risk right now.
Yeah, I mean, Sam, that's the part that's really bizarre. And I don't know how much you follow Bill Cairns, who was on just before you, but he's not into what you might call political tweets or sassy tweets, if you know the term. Right, yes. He's a less sassy tweeter than you, as far as I know. Right. And yet, take a look at what he felt compelled to do in his role as meteorologist. He writes to the president, "Sorry, today's not about you. We have a $1 billion weather disaster unfolding in South Carolina and North Carolina." Where does that fit in? The idea that, apart from any other political analysis, it's hard for Donald Trump to watch something that really is about the serious act of governing and preparation and dealing with hardship and not inserting himself.
Right. Well, I mean, look, and we've seen him do this, many times before. Some things that had less consequence, like, the inaugural attendance. And then there's a host of other things where he's just simply lied about stuff and then refused to back down off it. I mean, I think, the question is like, how much will this ultimately hurt him with the American public? For a lot of us, we're like, yeah, this seems to be par for the course. And of course, in this instance, there's a real danger that people could be in jeopardy because they actually listen to the president and take him seriously, or literally, as it were. But I think it speaks volumes that it is politicizing people like weathermen and meteorologists in that respect. And so, I mean, maybe it'll have some greater impact beyond this. It's genuinely bizarre, though.
Yeah. Sam and Juanita, my thanks to both of you. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.